In 1971, the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York City held a groundbreaking exhibit of antique pieced quilts called Abstract Design in American Quilts. It was curated by Jonathan Holstein and Gail Vanderhoff. Their pioneering work helped to spark the resurgence of interest in all aspects of quilt study in the last quarter of the 20th century. In 1976, the bicentennial ignited further interest in traditional arts and crafts. All-American Signature Quilt by Mina K. Kuth. Communities across the country made quilts reflecting patriotic themes and social-political commentary. Group quilt coordinated by Jen Gurakar. In fact, the Great Quilt Contest, sponsored by Good Housekeeping magazine, the U.S. Historical Society, and the Museum of American Folk Art, attracted 9,954 entries. Top prize winner, Ray of Light by Ginny Beyer. Not surprising, the quilting revival also made its way to Minnesota, but truth be known, quilting in Minnesota had never stopped, as evidenced by entries at county fairs and the Minnesota State Fair. Attributed to Lena Running, made in 1899 in Lisle, Minnesota. Our Minnesota Quilt Project has documented hundreds of quilts made in the first 3 quarters of the 20th century. Group quilt by the members of the Zion Lutheran Church, Minneapolis, 1912. However, the increased publicity about quilting continued to generate enthusiasm in even more Minnesotans. Following the national trend of forming local quilt groups, local quilters and teachers banded together to organize what was soon to become Minnesota Quilters. Their first activity was offering quilting classes. This quilt was made by Agnes Coopers, 1942. These quilters worked together to create the Minnesota Bicentennial Quilt, and later that same year 5 women drove to Warren, Michigan in a camper trailer to attend the Bicentennial National Quilt Contest to learn how to organize a quilt show. This is the official Minnesota Heritage Quilt commissioned by F&M Savings Bank in Minneapolis. It was designed and made by Bonnie Ellis. Mrs. Robert Stracy, a well-known quilter of Dakota County, had a part in the creation of the Minnesota Heritage Quilt. The quilt was recently presented to the state of Minnesota in ceremonies at the governor's mansion. Mrs. Stracy said it took her 2 weeks to finish the tiny stitches that went into the maroon and gold broadcloth quilt. The center of the quilt shows the state of Minnesota outlined in gold. In this map area, Mrs. Stracy stitched each of the 87 Minnesota counties outline. Surrounding the large center square are figures representing the Ojibwe and Sioux Indians, a lumberjack, a farmer, a miner, a flour mill, the historic Red River ox cart, a side-wheeler steamboat, and a steam locomotive. The loon, the state bird, is also depicted along with a tall pine tree, all in colorful pieces of fabric. On the outside border area, Mrs. Stracy stitched wagon wheels as a finishing quilting touch. In 1978, Minnesota Quilters was officially incorporated. The first membership meeting was June 9, 1978, at the Northeast Community Library in Minneapolis. The vision was to be, quote, statewide quilting organization to support quilters in Minnesota, unquote, a vision which the organization adheres to today. Making group quilts for a permanent MQ quilt collection and for fundraising was a priority for the new organization. An article in the July-August 1978 newsletter stated, MQ members are working on 2 projects to be raffled off in January at Minnesota's first quilting extravaganza called Winter Fantasy. An original pieced quilt designed by Helen Kelly, pictured on the left, called Snow Rose, and a unique wall hanging designed by Elaine Stracy with a winter carnival theme are MQ's current projects. There will be a quilt contest and an original block contest with ribbons and prizes, with an invitational exhibit of previous prize winners. The show coordinators are Jeannie Spears, in the middle, and Patricia Cox, on the right. The Snow Rose quilt is pictured in the background. By September 1978, the newsletter reported that Minnesota quilters working on the Snow Rose quilt to be used during the Winter Carnival were seen by thousands of people at the state fair. Reporters from the news media interviewed quilters, and Helen Kelly, MQ president, on the right, was on local television to spread news about the new organization. Winter Fantasy, or Frosty Fascination, was the second auction quilt for the 1979 show. It was designed and assembled by Elaine Stracy, and blocks were made by MQ members. It finished at 91 by 101 inches. In looking back, designer Elaine Stracy remembered, "The next year we were still low budget, but we decided to have another quilt show, and it was held during the Winter Carnival at the Hotel Radisson. We now had about 30 members. All were invited to design a quilt to finish and raffle off for our outstanding bills. My design didn't win, but they still wanted it made, so I designed blocks for each member and gave them the exact size. All were to be finished by a certain date. Lots of girls were puzzled, but at a quilt meeting in Stillwater, I had enough blocks completed, so I hung a sheet on a clothesline and pinned them in place, probably the only time a frame was finished before the center of a quilt." Here's a closer look at the individual blocks. The first one, called The Quilt Show, made by Nancy Rashka and Elaine Stracy. Ice Fishing by Leona Wilkins. Schoolhouse by Joyce Ofterheide. Carnival Royalty and the Ice Palace by Bonnie Ellis. Skating by Ann Deegan. The Flower Block by Helen Kelly. The Fan Block by Kathy Deming. Sunbonnet Sue by Jackie Erie. The Snowflake by Pat Cox. A Friendship Ring by Ellen Rasmussen. Ski Jump Event by Elaine Stracy. Blanket Toss by Agnes Lear. Rag Rug by Elaine Stracy. On October 19, 1978, a Burnsville newspaper article stated that the quilt will either be purchased by the Carnival Committee or auctioned off at the quilt show. In actuality, Arlene Swanson won the auction with a bid of $451. The family graciously donated the quilt back to Minnesota Quilters for its permanent collection after Arlene's passing. In case you think $451 is too low, when adjusted for inflation, that equals $2,327 in today's money. The final blocks are Carnival Vulcan by Ann Carlson, The Medallion by Nellie Bredesen, East Wind by Jeannie Spears, and The Dog Sled by Agnes Lear. Pat Cox and Jeannie Spears organized the very first Minnesota Quilt Show in St. Paul on January 25th through the 27th, 1979, to coincide with the St. Paul Winter Carnival. The theme was Winter Fantasy, and this was the official announcement about the show. I especially like the section which begins, "We will provide warm hospitality in the land where quilts are really appreciated." Now, if you were one of the 254 attendees, here's what you would have enjoyed viewing. 120 juried quilts at the Radisson Hotel, 85 quilts at the Landmark Center, 50 quilts at the Minnesota Historical Society, a special exhibit of antique quilts from the collection of Joyce Ofterheide, 2 auction quilts, and a fashion show. You will probably recognize some of the esteemed faculty: Michael James, Helen Kelly, Bonnie Ellis, Joyce Ofterheide, Patricia Cox, Jeannie Spears, Virginia Avery, and Jeffrey and Beth Gutchin, 3 of whom were later inducted into the Quilters Hall of Fame. Here's how Pat Cox remembers the event.
One of the members of the group was also a member of the Junior League, and the president of the Junior League thought it would be a great idea to have everybody make a block for a quilt. So I helped her put together the whole quilt for the Junior League because they wanted to do this for the National Bicentennial Quilt Show, which was 1976. But anyway, I got started teaching quilting at the beginning of 1970. I taught in the schools, the after school, and I had groups And I also, very soon, as soon as the quilt shops began, I got jobs at them to teach quilting. Jeannie Spears, at this point, had started trying to organize some of the quilt teachers in the group, and she had them meet at the YWCA in St. Paul. And after there was a group that met for a number of years, and Jeannie and I, she wanted to travel to see how the quilt shows were run in the country. So we traveled all over the country from the East Coast to the West Coast and hit all of the shows that were being organized at the beginning. There was Nebraska and Kansas and Mill Valley in California and Washington, D.C. And we went to Toronto, Canada, where there was a show there. And that's where I first met Michael James. I took a workshop from him in Toronto. And I had also met a lot of the people who were interested in quilting. There wasn't a great deal of publicity in that beginning, but there began to be as the National Bicentennial Quilt Show and the people who won the prizes at the quilt shows got publicity in some of the magazines. But the only magazine that really was doing quilting was Quilters Newsletter, and that had started in just before 1970, and it was beginning to pick up quite a bit of public opinion. But Jeannie and I had traveled to all of these shows, and about 1967, she said, maybe we should start a quilt group in Minnesota. So she got her husband to organize the bookwork for getting it started, and it started in 1968, actually, 78, I'm sorry, 1978. That was when Minnesota Quilters started, and we had meetings with the group of quilt teachers that she'd been organizing, and she's decided that the only way to get people to join the group was to have a show. So it was her idea to kind of play along with the publicity for the winter festivities that St. Paul had. That was one reason we chose January of 1979 as the time for the first show, because we got in a little bit on the publicity for all of the activities that were going on in St. Paul. And it was a lot of work to put this together. I was the main organizer. Jeannie did the quilt show, got asked for the quilts to be entered, and we got Carter Houck, who was the editor of Lady Circle Patchwork Quilt, to be the judge. And after all the shows that we had been to and so forth, I knew number of people who ran the things and who were doing the workshops. So I had a list of people that I contacted to see if I could get them to come to the Minnesota Quilt Show. I couldn't pay them. I didn't have any money. The only money we had in our kitty was $20 that we'd gotten from the members. So I had to ask these people as a favor if they would be willing to come to the Minnesota Quilt Show. And fortunately for me, most of them were willing to do it. I was able to get Michael James and Jeff Gutchin and some of the other people that were important. We also did a lot to get Minnesota people. Joyce Ofterheide from New Ulm, who had an extensive quilt collection from the 1930s on, was willing to come. And I got one of the teachers from the University of Minnesota in their St. Paul campus, Charlene Birmingham, to also teach, to have just a few people that had a bit of publicity, and other quilters knew who they were. And we set up a whole series of workshops and a quilt exhibit that Carter judged, and we had that exhibited. We were in the Radisson Hotel over in St. Paul, and they had said to me that I had to guarantee that I could fill 100 rooms, and I was thinking I didn't know how I was going to be able to do that, but actually I guess we did pretty well because we had, but we also were lucky that we were able to have a big quilt exhibit in a main building, which was in St. Paul, which had been the place for the lawyers before, but they had retired from it and no longer used the building. And we had nice big rooms where we could have the exhibit of quilts. It was a bit of a problem, though, at times, because lawyers kept running through wanting to know what in heaven's name we were doing in this building. But and one of the fun exhibits was Michael James had come, and he had brought a quilt to be in this exhibit. When he brought it, he gave me a list of all of the requirements to hang this quilt. It had to be so far off the floor, etc., all these things. And it was in the exhibit over at this other building, and he came to see that it was sure that it was properly hung. Unfortunately, the show was in winter. This was January. We had a lot of snow. Anyway, at the time he showed up, the governor's wife and her friend had decided to visit this quilt show and see what was going on. And her friend was wearing boots, white, for the snow outside, and Michael James saw these boots at the bottom, the top of her boots touched the bottom of his quilt, and he just had a hissy fit, and it just said that his quilt had to be taken down and put away. And of course, all of the things we'd used to get all these quilts organized had been put away. I had no idea where the stuff of his was at that point. But and I was afraid because he was teaching classes at the show, and I had no idea what he was going to do about that after he decided to walk out of the exhibit. But when we got back to the Radisson, he calmed down quite a bit anyway, and he did go through teaching the workshops that he did, but he was a difficult person to work with because in the first workshop he did, he charged everybody for all of the papers he gave them. But the next day he said he'd gotten enough money on the first class, he didn't have to do it with the second one. And you could imagine all the ladies who came to me and protested about this. Anyway, and I was worried about whether or not he was going to actually do the lecture that he had promised to do. But we managed to get all that worked out as well. But things were not easy to run, and I was just fortunate that we did, with the names that we'd gotten, did get enough people to come and see the show so that I made enough money to pay the people who came. And we actually made a little profit of about $3,000, which I thought was pretty good. Helen Kelly was one of the ones who gave a talk at the show, and she got quite a bit of attention because of it. She was a member of the teacher committee that we had, and she went on and did a lot of things with our quilt work because she was the only gal who was willing to take the job of president for Minnesota Quilters, and she did a good job in running it for the first 2-3 years.
At the end of June 1979, the first MQ collection quilt was begun by 15 MQ members who gathered at the Maple Grove home of Carol Jane Burdett for a cutting party. Carol Jane and Kathy Morton, designer of the quilt, had previously met at the Country Peddler quilt shop to select the fabrics. It was decided to piece the quilt by hand so that more members would have an opportunity to help. Both Kathy and Carol Jane were ambitious young women. If you could read the fine print, you would discover that each had 2 children under 5 when they took on this project, and Carol Jane was expecting her third. After handing out the pre-cut fabric packets at the July meeting, their goal was to have the top together by the August meeting so it could be quilted at the state fair. Numerous members contributed to the 288 hours the quilters spent demonstrating to the fairgoers. In the January 1980 newsletter, it was reported that after a brief business meeting, President Helen Kelly announced that the Loon Medallion quilt had been completed. The finished quilt measured 84 by 87 inches. Here's a close-up of the fabrics, piecing, and quilting. MQ has never been an organization to rest on its laurels, so in 1980 Joanne Holsnick led the project for the next collection quilt, which was a Minnesota sampler. In addition to making the quilt, the group had decided to submit block patterns to be used not only for the quilt but also for a book of patterns. Once again, the quilters pieced through the summer and quilted the sampler at the state fair. The finished quilt measured 96 by 108 inches, and the individual blocks were 12 inches. Here's a close-up of several of the original blocks. This is Josie's Heart by Jill Reese, Diamond Star by Carol Latala, Bud Bowl by Catherine LaRosa, Eric's Owl by Kathy Morton, Hearts a Plenty by Joanne Holsnick, Owl in the Shed by Bonnie Ellis, Aggie's Star by Agnes Lear, Borders by Aldine Steinhagen, Blossom by May Lockerbie, and Pansy in My Garden by Betty Flanagan. In June 1980, Bonnie Ellis presented the Minnesota Quilter banner, which was made and donated to the organization by Jeannie Spears. It is 29.5 inches square. It was decided that it would hang on the podium at both the day and evening meetings. Note the signature, documentation label, and hand quilting. The MQ pattern book was published in 1981 and contained 41 original and favorite quilt block patterns. It was first sold for $4 at the Northern Lights Quilt Show in April of that same year. A second edition was reprinted in 2003. The third quilt in the collection was the Arrowhead Medallion, made in 1981 and designed by Kathy Morton. Nancy Schell organized the committee of quilters to complete the project. A close-up of the center medallion, the hand quilting in the border, and the documentation label. A second Snow Rose quilt was made as the fourth MQ collection quilt in 1983. It used the same Diamond Star block pattern as the original, but with a different color palette. In the February 1984 newsletter, Wendy Richardson thanked the many quilters from Hudson, Wisconsin, Stillwater, and Forest Lake for their help in completing the quilt. Making and donating blocks for past MQ presidents has been a long-standing tradition. Lee Bradford was the third president of Minnesota Quilters, serving 2 terms, from 1981 to 82 and again from 1982 to 83. She made and donated 2 of the 4 past presidents' quilts that are in the MQ collection. This is Lee's quilt from her first term. Here's a close-up of a few of the donated blocks to that first quilt. The first one is a very happy Snoopy celebrating in front of the rainbow. Barbara Hort made a stylized version of the MQ initials. Helen Kelly contributed this pieced and appliqued block. The embroidered message on this block is "Quilting forever, housework whenever." Here's a brightly colored sunflower with a rainbow border. And Jeannie Spears contributed this traditional Sunbonnet Sue. Here is Lee's President's quilt from her second term. Here's a closer look at some of the blocks. You'll notice the fabrics that were available in the early 1980s and the creativity of the Minnesota quilters. Here's Linda's appliqued heart. Lynn Fredsel created this version of the Tudor Rose. Here's my favorite Sunbonnet Sue reading a book from the MQ library. Pat Wiswell's Sunbonnet Sue is off to market to fill her basket. Trudy Finden embroidered, "Your leadership has won our praise, now retire to well-earned leisure days." Wendy Richardson appliqued this charming 1930s cottage. As you looked at the blocks, you will notice that not all of the makers have been identified. If you know who made any of these blocks, please see an MQP member during the break. MQP continues its work in documenting Minnesota quilts, preserving Minnesota quilters' history, and contributing to our education and appreciation of our quilting legacy. We thank you for joining us for this glimpse into our MQ collection and for being a part of continuing our founder's vision to support quilters in Minnesota.